You're throwing your daddy's money into a swamp, boy. His uncle laughed as Frank, 19 years old, signed away his last $11,400 for 38 acres of marsh nobody had touched in 11 months. The whole county laughed with him. It's a mud puddle. The kid got taken. But his late grandmother had left 3 notebooks sealed inside a padlocked room, and one cold October morning, Frank reached into that black water and lifted out something that shone in the sun. The laughing stopped. What had been buried under those reeds for 62 years? There were maybe 4 black families in all of Oconto County, up in the cold, flat northeast corner of Wisconsin, and the Hadley farm was one of them. Frank had grown up on that farm the way a tree grows out of one particular field, shaped by exactly that wind and no other. He knew the looks. He had learned to read them before he had words for them. The half-second too long at the feed co-op counter, the way a stranger's eyes would travel from his face to the truck behind him and back again, running a kind of arithmetic that never quite came out in his favor. Somewhere around 12, he had stopped letting it move him. The farm was his answer to all of it. 83 head of dairy cattle, a milking parlor his father kept cleaner than most men kept their kitchens, and a deed paid down to within 8 years of clear title. You could not argue with land. Land did not care whose son you were. He was a quiet kid, and people mistook the quiet for a lot of things it wasn't. He had his father's hands and his grandmother's patience, which is to say he could fix almost anything if you left him alone with it long enough, and a flat place to lay the parts out. By the time he was 16, he was running half the equipment on the place and keeping the milk weight record so neatly that the county inspector complimented the work, though somehow never quite to his face. He did not need the county to tell him what he was worth. He had a herd and a deed and a grandmother who saw him, and for a while that had been enough to live inside. His father had built most of it, a broad and deliberate man who spoke in short sentences and meant every one of them. He had taught Frank to back a trailer at 9 and to run the skid loader at 14, and he had a way of standing at the edge of a field in the evening with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the herd the way other men looked at moving water. He died on a Tuesday in November of 2021 at 3 o'clock in the morning of a heart that simply stopped. He was 51. He would have been up by 4:30 to start the morning milking, and Frank had always taken a small, strange comfort in the timing, that his father had at least been spared the cold walk out to the parlor before it happened. His grandmother had been the other architect of him, though she came at the work from the opposite direction entirely. Vera Kowalik was his mother's mother, a small, exact woman of Polish stock who had grown up downstate and never quite lost the careful way she handled her vowels. She had come north to the farm the year Frank's mother died, when Frank was still small, and she had simply stayed, folding herself into the rhythm of a place that was not hers by blood and making it hers by attention instead. She kept the books. She kept the garden. She kept, above all, a small room off the back of the house, the old summer kitchen, joined to the main house by a narrow, covered passage that smelled of old rope and mouse dust, locked with a padlock whose key lived on a length of green string around her neck. Storage, she always said when he asked. Broken things, nothing worth your time. He had believed her, the way a child believes the things adults say with enough flatness. People will tell you a door is nothing for long enough that you stop seeing the door at all. Vera died in January of 2022, 2 months after his father, in a county home over in Shawano with a window that looked out on a parking lot. The wall calendar in the farmhouse kitchen was still turned to that month a year later, the way certain things in a grieving house simply stop where they are. By then, Frank was 19. And he was alone in a way that had nothing to do with the people still technically around him. The will was read in December, in a lawyer's office in Oconto Falls that smelled of burnt coffee, and the trouble was hidden inside a single clause that no one in the room thought to fear. His father's attorney, a careful older man named Walter Prout, read it through without slowing, and it was only afterward, going back over the pages, that the danger surfaced. The clause named Dale, his father's younger brother, as co-executor, with authority to assume sole ownership of the farm in the event that the primary beneficiary, Frank, was a minor, or still enrolled in secondary school at the time of his father's death. Frank had turned 19 in October. He had graduated the previous May. By any plain reading, the clause was already spent, a precaution that had outlived its purpose. But it had been drafted in 2014, when Frank was 10, by a different lawyer in a different decade, and the language was just loose enough, minor or still in secondary school with no date attached, no clear word on which condition governed, that a hungry man with the right attorney could pull at the seam and see if it gave. Dale had been, for most of Frank's life, a voice on the telephone and a folding chair at Christmas, a man whose relationship to the farm was the relationship of a creditor to a debt he had never gotten around to collecting. When he saw the clause, something in him woke up. He hired a lawyer out of Green Bay who believed less in the law than in patience, and the two of them set about testing the seam in the Oconto County Circuit Court, and they kept testing it for 14 months. Frank watched his uncle move into the farmhouse in January, the same month Vera died. He watched him begin to make decisions about the herd the way a man makes decisions about a thing he does not love and does not intend to keep. The Holsteins went first, the three highest producers, sold in February because the price was decent, and because Frank suspected his uncle simply needed to feel the weight of the place pass through his hands and turn into money. By the following autumn, the herd was down from 83 head to 39. A compressor in the milking parlor failed in September, and his uncle let it sit unbothered for 6 weeks, until Frank drove out on a Sunday and fixed it himself with parts he paid for out of his own pocket. His uncle never mentioned it. Frank had not expected him to. The thing that wore on him was not the cruelty of any of it. It was the arithmetic, the way his uncle understood the market value of every animal and every acre with perfect clarity, and understood the actual worth of none of it. A herd his father had built over 20 years was being read like a column of figures and entered, line by line, into someone else's ledger. The court took its time. Prout believed in the process, in the slow, correct turning of the machinery, and he was not wrong, only slow. Dale's attorney believed in fatigue, in the way a young man with $11,000 and a dead father will eventually run out of the will to keep showing up. And on a Monday in March of 2023, the circuit court ruled on the question of ambiguity, and it ruled for the uncle, and it granted him sole ownership of the farm, the herd, the house, and the 8 remaining years of mortgage that came with all of it. The following Friday, a sheriff's deputy came up the gravel drive with the paperwork. Frank knew him. He had graduated 3 years ahead of Frank from Oconto Falls High School, and he stood on the porch in the cold with the envelope held out, and he would not raise his eyes from the boards. Frank signed where he was told to sign. He had 30 days to vacate. When the deputy was gone, Frank sat at the kitchen table and did the only honest accounting left to him. He had a checking account at the People's State Bank in Oconto with $11,400 in it. Part of it his own savings scraped together since he was 15, part of it the small estate Vera had left him, released without comment by a lawyer in Shawano. He had his father's truck, an old Ford with a quarter panel going soft with rust, and he had 30 days. The county would have told you the story was already over. The last night in a house you grew up in has a particular weight to it. Not grief exactly, but something closer to the pressure that sits in the air before a storm, when everything has already changed and only the sound has yet to arrive. It was the 28th of March, a Tuesday, and the temperature had dropped back to 19 degrees after a false thaw, so that the mud in the yard had frozen again into ridged furrows that caught the headlights when he pulled the truck up close to the side door. He left the engine running and told himself he would be quick, and he was not. He stood in the kitchen a long time, not taking anything, only looking at the things he could not take. The hook by the back door where his father's barn coat still hung. Dale had already said he was keeping it, said it fit him, said it with no expression at all. The calendar still turned to January of the year before. The chip in the plaster above the window that he had put there himself long ago with something he'd had no business throwing indoors. By 11 o'clock he had his boxes loaded, 2 of them from the feed store. 19 years in that house, and it had somehow compressed itself into 2 cardboard boxes. What was left was the summer kitchen, padlocked at the end of its narrow passage. It had been locked his whole life. His grandmother had kept the key, and after she was gone, no one had a reason to open it, and his uncle, when he took the house, had simply left the lock where it hung. Storage, they had all said. Broken equipment, nothing worth your time. He took a bolt cutter from behind the truck seat. It gave in one motion. The room inside was small and cold and smelled of iron and mildew. Half-collapsed shelves ran along the far wall, holding mason jars too old to read, a rusted washboard, a butter churn with a cracked stave. He moved the flashlight slowly across all of it, not certain what he was looking for, only certain, for the first time, that the people who had told him there was nothing here were the same people who had kept it locked. The false panel was behind the bottom shelf. He felt the edge of it before he saw it, a seam in the boardwork that did not match the rest, a quarter-inch gap that was not rot. He worked it loose with his fingers and with the flathead screwdriver he had carried in his coat pocket since he was 14. Behind it sat a tin box, green, water-stained, the lid sealed with electrical tape gone brittle and brown. He did not open it there. He carried it out under his arm in the dark, set it on the passenger seat, and drove away from the house without looking back. He drove for 40 minutes with no destination, missed a turn twice without noticing, and ended up parked outside a closed bait shop with the engine ticking cool and the dashboard clock reading past 1 in the morning. Then he turned the truck around and drove back and let himself into the farmhouse one last time. Not to take anything, only to use the kitchen table, which was his for 9 more hours. He set the box under the overhead light and peeled the tape off in pieces. The lid lifted with the small resistance of a thing that had not moved in years. Inside were 3 composition notebooks, the cheap marbled kind, swollen at the edges from old humidity, held together with a rubber band that broke without ceremony the moment he touched it. In the bottom corner of the top cover, in blue ballpoint, in handwriting he knew the way you know a smell or a season, someone had written, June 1971, V.K. His grandmother had used those initials her whole life, on everything she counted as hers. He opened the cover. The first entry was dated the 14th of June, 1971, and the writing was small and exact, each letter finished before the next began. She had been driving back from Pound, she wrote, on a road she did not usually take, and had turned down Dunar Road on impulse because she'd heard there was a property for sale near the county line. She never found the property. What she found instead was a break in the tree line where the road curved, and beyond it a wide sedge meadow that opened out, and past that water, dark and still between the cattail stands, a red-winged blackbird working the edge of the reeds. The meadow smelled, she wrote, of iron and cold grass. She had sat on the hood of the car for 20 minutes and had not wanted to leave. The last line of the entry said only that she intended to come back. Frank read it twice. He had never once heard her speak of any of it. A whole interior life, folded into a locked room and sealed behind a panel, and the woman who had kept his father's books and weeded his father's garden had been carrying the entire time the memory of a marsh on a road most people in the county couldn't have found if you'd handed them a map. He did not sleep. In the gray before the sun, he sat in the truck with his phone and found the parcel on the county land records, because some part of him had to know whether the place she described still existed in the world or only in the notebook. It existed. 38 acres on Dunar Road, assessed at $9,200, listed for $11,400, sitting untouched on the county website for 11 months. Wet meadow, marsh, no utilities, seasonal access only. Development potential limited, the agent's note said, which meant none, which was why no one had touched it. $11,400, the exact figure that stood between him and nothing. The sensible thing was obvious, and every reasonable voice he had ever known would have named it for him. Take the money and the truck and drive south to a city and a job and a life that did not begin with a swamp. But he had read the entry 3 times by then, and he kept coming back to the same impossible fact, that the price of the land and the whole of his inheritance were, down to the dollar, the same number. As if the Marsh had been waiting for exactly him, and exactly now, and exactly this much. He started the truck. For the weeks it took the sale to come together, Frank lived on a borrowed cot in the basement of a church in Oconto Falls, the tin box pushed under the frame where he could feel it with his heel. He read the notebooks at night after the building went quiet, and in the mornings, before the sale was anything more than a number on a screen, he drove out to see the Marsh for himself, because some part of him had to know whether the place she had written about still existed in the world or only on the page. It was the 9th of April, a Sunday, and he pulled the truck off the road at a break in the tree line that he recognized before he had any right to. The gap, then the sedge, then the water opening out beyond, exactly as she had set it down 52 years earlier. The cattails stood winter brown, matted flat where the snow had melted off them. 2 red-winged blackbirds were already working the same reed edge she had described, calling in that short metallic sound like a hinge that wants oil. He walked the perimeter in the cold. His boots went through the surface crust twice and came up black to the ankle, and the ground moved a little underfoot, the way ground does when there is water close beneath it, not far down, only waiting. On the east edge, where the property line met the tree break, he found the ditch. It was maybe 4 feet across and running, cut straight south the way a machine makes a thing, functional and deliberate. The water moved through it clear over a dark, muck bottom, steady and quiet, draining off everything the marsh should have been holding. He had seen that ditch before, in pencil. In the second notebook, she had sketched this exact cut and fixed its position with a compass bearing off the road, and beside it, she had written one word, underlined twice: reversible. He called the listing number at 11:43 that morning and said he wanted to make an offer. The offer came back accepted on a Thursday, and he closed the following week, on the 19th of April, at a title company called Lakeland on Main Street in Oconto, a low office with a gray ridge of old snow still packed against the curb. The woman at the desk was around 60 and asked him nothing he did not expect. She went through the pages in order, and he signed 11 times and handed over a cashier's check for $11,400. $5,400 of it scraped together since he was 15, and the rest drawn from the small estate his grandmother had left. She dated the last page and slid a copy across in a manila envelope, and she told him congratulations in the flat voice of someone who had said it 20 times that week and meant it none of those times. He thanked her. He was 19 years old, and he owned 38 acres of marsh. The county made up its mind about him quickly. Word of a thing like that does not sit still in a place that size, and by the end of the week, the men at the co-op had their version of it, and the version did not flatter him. A kid had taken the whole of what his father left and poured it into the worst piece of ground on Dunar Road, the one swamp nobody with any sense had touched in 11 months. And there was a particular pleasure some of them took in the telling. Frank had spent his life reading the half-second too long at counters, the arithmetic that ran across a stranger's face and never came out his way, and he could hear all of it underneath the laughter now, the old assumption dressed up as concern, that a boy like him could not have known what he was doing, that he had been taken, that the swamp had been waiting for exactly the kind of fool the county had already decided he was. He let them talk. He had a deed in an envelope and 3 notebooks under a cot, and there was nothing in the laughter he could use. He drove out to the land that same afternoon, and a man came down the road from the north while he sat at the gate, unhurried, in a canvas barn coat the color of old moss. He stopped on the passenger side and looked out at the water the way a person looks at a thing he has known a long time. He was 74, and he gave his name as Raymond. He had lived a half-mile up that road since 1971, he said, and he had watched the listing come and go twice and wondered who would finally take it. When Frank asked if he knew the place, Raymond looked at the channels a while before he answered, and what he said was that when he was a boy, before 1961, there had been wild rice here. Raymond described the stands the way a man describes something he can still see, the height of it in August, the canoes on the water in late September, the way the grain bent in the wind before it was ready. A timber company had dug the east ditch that year, he said, and by the following spring the rice was gone, and he had not seen it come back in 62 years. Frank reached into the cab and handed him the second notebook, open to the page with the pencil sketch of the ditch, and Raymond studied it a long while, tracing the contour marks and the bend in the cut with one finger, and the notation beside it in Vera's small, exact hand. Plug here, clay preferred, 4T minimum. Then he handed it back and said that whoever had drawn that knew exactly what she was looking at. Frank told him she had stood on this same road. Raymond nodded the way a man nods at a thing he has already half guessed. He read all 3 notebooks across May and into June, not once but 3 times, cover to cover, the way you read a thing when you need to hold it in your body and not only your head. The hydrology sketches sat on the right-hand pages and the written observations on the left, and she had tied them together with small numbers in red pencil, so that every field note matched its drawing exactly. He walked the land with the second notebook open in his hand, finding her reference points. She had used a lightning-struck white pine at the northeast corner as her anchor, and it was still there, split down the middle and gray as bone, holding its shape the way old things do when nothing disturbs them. He framed a one-room cabin out of salvaged lumber on a dry rise at the south edge. 1 room and a wood stove and a shelf for the notebooks, because he had nowhere else to be, and a man ought to sleep on his own ground. The bank account was empty now, every dollar of it gone into the deed, so he did the only thing he knew how to do and put his hands to work. He took on equipment repair for the farms up and down that stretch of county. A baler that wouldn't tie, a loader with a blown hydraulic line, the small breakdowns every dairy carries into the season, and the cash came in slow and steady and went straight back out again, into diesel and groceries and the work the Marsh needed. Word that the Hadley boy could fix anything mechanical traveled faster than the word about the swamp, and some weeks the 2 reputations sat side by side in the same man's mouth. On the second Monday of May, he rented a tracked mini excavator from a company over in Marinette. The rate was $480 a week, and he paid for 3 weeks up front, money he earned with a wrench and turned around the same afternoon. The man at the counter asked whether he had any experience with the controls, and Frank told him he had run equipment on a dairy farm since he was 14, and the man handed him the keys without another word. The work was slow and exact. The ditch ran 4 feet deep along its worst section and 60 yards before it curved east toward the county drainage, and the second notebook marked 3 places to close it. He started at the middle one, loading clay from the spoil pile he had cleared off the east bank, tamping it in layers and reinforcing each plug with timber he cut from a deadfall oak at the tree line. When the middle plug held, he moved to the others. The water held, and then it began to rise, slowly, the way things fill when they have been waiting a long time to. His uncle came out on a Thursday afternoon in late May. Frank heard the truck before he saw it, a clean white Ram that slowed at the gate and stopped. Dale did not get out. He rolled the window down instead, the same gesture Raymond had made, and nothing else about it was the same. He told Frank he was wasting the best years of his life on a puddle. Frank was sitting in the excavator's seat a dozen feet out in the marsh, and he looked at his uncle once, then lowered the bucket and went back to work. And after a while, he heard the window go up and the gravel turn the other way. In early June, he drove 2 short stakes into the basin floor, one near the middle plug and one out at the deep north end, and he began reading them every few days, scratching the numbers into the margin of a green pocket notebook he kept in his coat. The first real measurement came on the 3rd of July, just after 6 in the morning, the water sitting 6 inches up the near stake. He wrote it down and stood there a moment, looking at it the way you look at a thing you weren't entirely sure you believed in until that exact second. By the 14th, it was 14 inches. The basin had gone from mud and standing puddles to something that moved, something with weight and a direction, and in the mornings a thin mist came off it. The red-winged blackbirds were working the cattail fringe along the east edge now, which told him something about the insects, which told him something about the health of the water. He was deep in the 3rd notebook by then. On page 41, she had labeled a small diagram in the upper corner with 2 words in pencil: rice water, and beneath it a range, 22 to 26 inches. On the 21st of July, he measured the deep north basin at 26 inches exactly. He sat down on the bank with his boots in the shallows and did nothing dramatic. He only sat. It was Raymond who found the first of them. He had come down on a Sunday morning the last week of July, walking the perimeter slow and without announcement the way he did, and he stopped along the north edge near an old half-sunk log and simply stood. And when Frank came over, he turned his open hand toward the water, palm down, the way you gesture at a thing that needs no introduction. Seedlings were coming up in a loose scatter along a 20-foot stretch, thin and bright green, no taller than the width of a palm. Wild rice, seed that had been locked in the airless mud since 1961 or before, waiting with the kind of patience that has nothing to do with hope and everything to do with chemistry. They had simply begun. The morning after the seedlings showed, Frank started setting watercress in the 2 inflow channels that ran in from the northeast, where the water came cool and moving the way the plant needed it. He pressed each crown into the substrate at the waterline by hand, 8 inches apart, a flat of 60, and then a second flat, working north to south in the shallows while the blackbirds argued overhead. The marsh was no longer only filling, it was answering him back. The last week of August came in heavy, the air sitting low over the water with a humid stillness that put a sweat on every surface. Frank was on the south bank, cutting back a stand of reed canary grass that was crowding the channel when he heard tires on the gravel. 2 doors this time, 2 men. He recognized one of them before he straightened up. His uncle walked the edge of the gate the way he always walked, taking a kind of inventory of something he had decided already belonged to him. The other man wore a collared shirt and leather shoes that had no business within 50 feet of a marsh, and he carried a manila folder, which told Frank most of what he needed to know before anyone had said a word. The man introduced himself as Clifford Trent, out of Green Bay. He worked in land development and acquisitions, he said, in the careful, neutral way people say such things when they want the words to sound like arithmetic, inevitable, and not worth arguing with. He offered $27,000 for the parcel. Frank set the cutting blade down in the grass and looked at the folder Trent was holding out toward him. $27,000 was more than twice what he had paid in April. It was also, he knew, less than what he had already put into this ground. The land and the excavator and the seed and the crowns and the timber and the whole of a summer he could not get back. And Trent would have known that too if he had been out here any earlier than this exact and convenient moment. The 2 of them stood on the dry side of the gate with the offer hanging in the wet August air, and Frank understood the shape of what they were assuming, that he would be grateful. That a number twice his purchase price was a thing a boy like him took and said thank you for and walked away from while the walking was good. And there was a version of the afternoon in which he took it. $27,000 was a year of not worrying, a deposit on some ordinary apartment in some city where no one had decided in advance what he was. It would have closed the books on the whole business and handed every man at the co-op the ending they were already telling. He stood there long enough to feel the full pull of it. Then he told them to leave. His uncle said his name once, the way he used to say it when Frank was small, and he believed he was correcting him. Frank did not answer it. He turned back to the reed canary grass and went on working, and he kept working until he heard 2 doors again and the gravel turning the other way. That evening, he sat at the camp table in the cabin with the 3rd notebook open in front of him. He had read most of it across the summer. The water measurements from 1987, the hand-drawn profile of the ditch, the dense small notes on substrate and flow. But there were pages near the back he had never reached, and with the offer still sitting on the day like a weight, he reached them now. The last entry was dated the 14th of September, 1991. Her handwriting had gone smaller there, crowded, as though she were rationing the space she had left. She wrote that she had never found the money to buy the Marsh. She had watched it every season for nearly 20 years, and she had never once been able to make the numbers come out. She wrote that she hoped someone who loved it would find it eventually, someone who would close the ditch and let the water climb back to its old level. The rice would come back, she wrote, and she seemed certain of that in a way she had not been certain of one other thing on any of those pages. Frank read the entry again, and then a 3rd time. He had built the whole of this summer on the belief that the woman who wrote these notebooks had known something, had left him a map drawn by a hand that understood the ground. And she had. But the map ended here, at a confession in cramped pencil, and what it confessed was that she had stood exactly where he was standing now and had never been able to cross. 20 years of watching, and she had never bought it. She had died downstate in a county home with a window on a parking lot, and she had never seen the rice return, had only believed, on faith, that it would, and handed the believing forward to whoever came after her. He was 19, and he had spent nearly everything he had. The land had taken the last of his father's money, and every dollar he had earned with his hands since had gone straight back into the same ground. The excavator and the seed and the lumber and the whole of a summer's wages poured into water. There was a hard Wisconsin winter coming on with nothing in the basin yet but green stalks that had not made a single grain of anything a person could sell. He had turned down $27,000 that afternoon, real money, certain money, to keep faith with a dream its own author had never managed to reach. Sitting there with the lamp on and the notebook open, he could not have said honestly whether he had done a brave thing or a foolish one. And for the first time since he had cut the lock off the summer kitchen, the men at the co-op did not sound entirely wrong. Outside the cabin, the marsh was dark and making its small sounds. The frogs, the water moving somewhere below the cattails, something large and slow shifting through the reeds to the north, and none of it answered him. The summer's green had done exactly what the second notebook promised, but a field of standing stalks was not a thing a man could sell, and the not knowing rode with Frank through the back of September and into October. The heads had come up tall along the channels by then, the grain hanging in loose panicles that bent in the wind the way Raymond had described it from 60 years before. And every morning Frank walked the north edge and looked at it, and could not say whether it would carry him through or shatter into the water and leave him with nothing. Wild rice does not keep a man's schedule. He had read as much in the second notebook and heard the rest from Raymond on one of the old man's slow walks along the perimeter. The grain ripened unevenly and fell when it was ready, a few heads at a time. And if you came too early, it was milk and paste in the hull and worth nothing. And if you came too late, the wind and the birds had already taken the season down into the muck. There was a window, and it was narrow, and missing it on either side meant the whole year had been for nothing. The $11,400, the rented excavator, the lost summer, the $27,000 he had turned away on the dry side of the gate, the faith he had kept with a woman who had watched this water for 20 years and died without ever once crossing. And he could not see how to bring it in. He had no canoe and no second pair of hands, and no notion really of how the thing was done past what the notebook sketched. Somewhere across the county, the men at the co-op were still telling their version of him. The boy who had buried his father's money in a swamp, and the harvest was the only argument he had against them, and he did not know how to make it alone. The frost came on a Tuesday in late October, thin and white across the sedge, gone by 8 in the morning. He had been watching the heads for 2 weeks by then, testing them the way the second notebook described, pressing a single grain between his thumbnail and the pad of his finger and feeling for the resistance. Not hard, but not soft either. A particular give that meant the starch inside had set. For 2 weeks the grain had yielded too easily, and he had made himself wait, which was its own kind of labor, standing over the one thing you have staked your whole life on and doing nothing, because the doing is not yet yours to choose. On the 23rd, he pressed a grain and felt it push back against the nail, firm and whole, set the way she had written it would be. He stood in the cold shallows with that single grain between his fingers, and he understood 2 things at once: that the window was open, and that it would not stay open long, and that the frost which had spared the grain this morning would not keep sparing it. He went back to the cabin and did not sleep, because a man does not sleep the night before the only thing that has ever mattered. Raymond arrived before sunrise on the morning of the 24th, his truck moving slow along Dunar Road with no headlights at all, which Frank understood only later was because Raymond had driven that road in the dark enough times across 50 years that he no longer needed them. There was a canoe on the roof, an aluminum Old Town dented along both gunnels, with the year 1987 scratched into the bow thwart in small, uneven numbers. Raymond did not say good morning. He set a thermos on the camp table outside the cabin, and the 2 of them carried the canoe down to the water together in the gray light. How the old man had known the morning had come, Frank never asked. Raymond had been reading that Marsh since before Frank was born, and perhaps the frost had told him, or perhaps he had simply been waiting up the road for the day the boy would need him and had decided not to make him come and ask for it. They worked without much talking. Raymond showed him the stroke the first time, 2 cedar sticks worn smooth with handling, one to bend the heads down over the hull and one to knock them, drawn in a low, easy arc that took the ripe grain and left the green standing for another day. Then Frank did it on his own side, clumsy at first and then less so, and the grain came down against the aluminum in a sound like rain starting on a tin roof. A few grains, and then a soft, rushing patter as he found the rhythm of it. And this was the thing the whole county had not come out to see. On water that had been black mud and standing puddles in the spring, the worst piece of ground on Dunar Road, the swamp a boy had been laughed at for buying, Frank drew the cedar sticks through the heads and watched the grain pour down into the belly of the canoe and catch the first low sun coming across the reeds. It was not gold. It was better than gold, because gold was not a thing he could have grown. It was dark and slender and faintly green at the tip, wet and shining where the light found it, piling up between his boots an inch at a time. And every handful of it was the marsh saying back to him the thing his grandmother had believed for 20 years and never lived to hear. The husks shone. The water shone where the paddle disturbed it, and there was no one there to see it but an old man who had known the place when it was last alive, and a boy who had brought it back. And that, Frank thought, was exactly as it should be. Raymond did not praise the work, and Frank did not expect him to. The old man knocked his own side of the canoe in the same low rhythm he had likely used as a boy, and now and then he named a thing without being asked. A heron lifting off the far reeds, the place where the channel ran deepest, the way the wind would come up after noon and take the looser grain if they did not hurry. It was the most either of them said all day, and it was enough. They moved through the bed slowly, the north channel and then the open water and then the south, and by midday the canoe sat low and heavy, and Frank's arms had gone past tired into a clean, deep ache that ran from the wrist up into the shoulder, the kind of ache he had not felt since the dairy. They beached the canoe and emptied it onto tarps in the sun and went back out for more. The second day they finished the watercress by hand from the south edge, working the inflow channels where the crowns he had set in July had spread into thick, dark mats, cutting and rinsing and loading it into the coolers he had borrowed from the feed store over in Suring. By the end of it, his hands were wrinkled and cold, and his back was one long complaint, and he could not remember being more glad of anything. They drove to Oconto Falls on the afternoon of the second day, the bags loaded in the truck bed under a tarp, and pulled around to the loading dock at the co-op where a platform scale was set into the concrete. The woman behind the counter barely looked up when they came in, the same flat county indifference Frank had been handed at every counter his whole life, and she watched the needle settle and wrote the numbers down without ceremony. 1,140 pounds of wild rice, 280 pounds of watercress. She circled the total at the bottom and tore the slip off and held it out. Raymond stood beside the scale and looked at the number for a long time without speaking. Then he turned to Frank, and what he said was 7 words. Your grandmother would have loved this place. Frank held the slip in both hands and did not answer him, because there was nothing he could have said to that which would not have made it smaller. Raymond had known her longer than Frank had. He already knew it was true. The co-op took the rice, and a restaurant group out of Minneapolis took the watercress and a share of the grain besides, the kind of kitchens that paid for a thing because of where it came from and how little of it there was. The sales agreement came back from a fax line in Marinette on a Tuesday, the 7th of November. 2 pages from the co-op and 4 from the restaurant group, printed on paper that felt heavier than it needed to. Frank signed all of it at the small table in the cabin he had framed out of salvaged lumber over the summer. 1 room and a wood stove, and a shelf where the 3 notebooks stood. And the check cleared on the Thursday after. $34,000. It sat in the same checking account at the People's State Bank that had held $11,400 in April, the account he had nearly emptied at the title company. And Frank looked at the number on his phone for a while and felt something that was not quite triumph, something quieter and harder to name. Clifford Trent had offered $27,000 for the land itself, the whole 38 acres, deed and water and all, and had expected the boy to take it and be grateful. One season of the Marsh, run the way his grandmother had drawn it, had brought in more than that, and Frank still owned every acre of the ground it had come off. He thought about the manila folder and the leather shoes that had no business near the water, and he did not feel like gloating over any of it. He only felt, for the first time, that the arithmetic had finally come out his way. He paid off the land note that same afternoon by phone, the whole of it at once. The woman at the county office told him congratulations in a flat voice that meant she had said it 20 times that day, and Frank told her thank you, and that was the end of it. The offer on the 2 adjacent acres went in on the Friday morning. The parcel had been sitting in a county tax delinquency file for 3 years, unwanted because no one had ever looked at this whole stretch of Dunar Road as anything but standing water and mosquitoes, and Frank offered a fair price and expected to wait a week to hear. He heard back in 2 days. That Friday night, he sat at the table in the cabin with the first notebook open in front of him and the wood stove ticking. And outside the window there was nothing at all. No yard light, no road noise, only the dark and the small sounds of water moving somewhere below the cattails. He turned to one of the entries from that first autumn, the 14th of October, 1971, written in pencil pressed so hard that the letters stood up in a faint ridge on the back of the page. She had set down the color of the water in the afternoon light, and the angle of the ditch where it cut through the lower meadow and killed the flow. And then a line he read once to himself, and then again aloud, to the empty room and the stove and the marsh beyond the glass. Something lived here once, and the evidence is still in the sediment. The husks don't lie, and neither does the depth. He banked the stove and went to the window. The 2 delinquent acres he had just bought ran along the far north edge, past the lightning-struck pine, into a second low basin that still held its old ditch and its old silence, 60-some years of standing water that no one in the county had ever bothered to want. He had walked it once already in the cold, and he had felt the ground move underfoot the way it moves when there is water close beneath it, not far down, only waiting. There was another marsh out there in the dark, and he already knew, the way she would have known, exactly what it was. He meant to be the one who closed the ditch and let it climb back to the level it had held before anyone now living could remember. And maybe that is where the story wants to leave you. Frank was not handed a farm. That is the part the whole county never understood. He was handed a loss, a padlocked room, a truck with the paint going soft on one panel, $11,400 he wasn't sure he could afford to spend, and a grandmother who had carried a Marsh around inside her for 20 years and never once found the money to reach it. From the outside, it looked like nothing. It looked to every man leaning on that co-op counter like the worst kind of nothing, the kind a foolish boy throws his whole inheritance away on. But the loss turned out to be a map. It just took the right notebook to read it. And here is the thing worth carrying out of it. There are rooms like that on a lot of land, and in a lot of families. There are drawers nobody has opened in 40 years because somebody, once, decided that whatever was inside them was not worth the trouble, and everybody who came after simply believed it. There are padlocks left hanging long after anyone remembers what they were meant to keep out. Most of them really are just old jars and a cracked butter churn and nothing more. But every so often, one of them has been waiting the whole time for exactly you and exactly now. The people laughing at the gate are almost never the people who can read what is written in the water. So if there is a door in your life that somebody told you was nothing, a box, a notebook, a stretch of ground everyone keeps telling you to walk away from, consider this the gentle push to go and open it. You might find old jars. You might find a map. You will not know which until you cut the lock. And if you do open it, I would honestly love to hear what was behind it. If there is a locked room somewhere in your own life, something you have been circling for years, tell me about it down in the comments. I do read them, and somebody scrolling past needs to hear that the thing they were laughed at for can be the very thing that pays off in the end. Because there is still a second marsh out past that pine. The ditch is still cut. The water is still waiting. And somewhere out there, quietly, so is yours.